still sitting at the turnings of the road. Mary stared at the lines of marching stones. They were worn in black. Some were leaning, some were fallen, some cracked or broken. They looked like rows of old and hungry teeth. He wondered what they could be, and he hoped that the king was not going to follow them into the darkness beyond. Then he saw that there were clusters of tents and booths on either side of the stony way, but these were not set near the trees, and seemed rather to huddle away from them towards the brink of the cliff. The greater number were on the right, where the Firienfeld was wider, and on the left there was a smaller camp, in the midst of which stood a tall pavilion. From this side a river now came out to meet them, and they turned from the road. As they drew near, Mary saw that the rider was a woman with long braided hair gleaming in the twilight. Yet she wore a helm that was clad to the waist like a warrior and girded with a sword. She cried. "And you, Éowyn," said Théoden, "is all well with you?" She answered, yet it seemed to Mary that her voice belied her, and he would have thought that she had been weeping, if that could be believed for one so stern of face. It was a weary road for the people to take, torn suddenly from their homes. They were hard words, for it is long since war has driven us from the green fields, but there have been no evil deeds. And all is now ordered, as you see, and your lodging is prepared for you, for I have had full tidings of you and knew the hour of your coming.
So Aragorn has come then,
said Éomer.
Is he still here?
No, he is gone, said Éowyn, turning away and looking at the mountains dark against the east and south.
Whither did he go?
I do not know, she answered. He came at night and rode away yestermorn ere the sun had climbed over the mountain tops. He is gone.
You are grieved, daughter,
said Théoden.
What has happened? Tell me. Did he speak of that road?
He pointed away along the darkening lines of the stones towards the Dwimmerberg.
Of the paths of the dead?
Yes, Lord, said Éowyn, and he passed into the shadows from which none have returned. I could not dissuade him. He is gone.
Then our paths are sundered,
said Éomer.
He is lost. We must ride without him, and our hope dwindles.
Slowly they passed through the short heath and upland grass, speaking no more until they came to the king's pavilion. There Mary found that everything was made ready, and that he himself was not forgotten. A little tent had been pitched for him besides the king's lodging, and there he sat alone, while men passed to and fro, going in to the king and taking counsel with him. Night came on, and the half-seen heads of the mountains westwards were covered with stars, but the east was dark and blank. The marching stones faded slowly from sight, but still beyond them, blacker than the gloom, brooded the vast crouching shadow of the Dwimmerberg. "The paths of the dead," he muttered to himself. "The paths of the dead. What does all this mean? They have all left me now. They have all gone to some doom. Gandalf and Pippin to the war in the east, and Sam and Frodo to Mordor, and Strider and Legolas and Gimli to the paths of the dead. But my turn will come soon enough, I suppose. I wonder what they're all talking about, and what the king means to do, for I must go where he goes now." In the midst of these gloomy thoughts, he suddenly remembered that he was very hungry, and he got up to go and see if anyone else in this strange camp felt the same. But at that very moment a trumpet sounded, and a man came summoning him, the king's esquire, to wait at the king's board. In the inner part of the pavilion was a small space, curtained off with broidered hangings and strewn with skins, and there at a small table sat Théoden with Éomer and Éowyn, and Dunher, lord of Harrowdale. Mary stood beside the king's stool, and waited on him till presently the old man, coming out of deep thought, turned to him and smiled.
"Come, Master Meriadoc,"
he said.
"You shall not stand. You shall sit beside me as long as I remain in my own lands, and lighten my heart with tales."
Room was made for the hobbit at the king's left hand, but no one called for any tale. There was indeed little speech, and they ate and drank for the most part in silence, until at last, plucking up courage, Mary asked the question that was tormenting him. "Twice now, Lord, I've heard of the paths of the dead," he said. "What are they? And where is Strider, Lord Aragorn, where is he gone?" The king sighed, but no one answered, until at last Éomer spoke.
"We do not know, and our hearts are heavy,"
he said.
"But as for the paths of the dead, you have yourself walked on their first steps. Nay, I speak no words of ill omen. The road that we have climbed is the approach to the door yonder in the dim hold. But what lies beyond no man knows, said Théoden. Yet ancient legend now seldom spoken has somewhat to report. If these old tales speak true that have come down from father to son in the house of Eol, then the door under Dwimmerberg leads to a secret way that goes beneath the mountain to some forgotten end. But none have ever ventured in to search its secrets since Baldur, son of Brago, passed the door, and was never seen among men again. A rash vow he spoke as he drained the horn at that feast in which Brago made to hallow new-built Meadow Seld, and he came never to the high seat of which he was the heir. Folk say the dead men out of the dark years guard the way, and they will suffer no living man to come in their hidden halls. But at whiles they may themselves be seen passing out of the door like shadows, and down the stony road. Then the people of Harrowdale shut fast their doors and shroud their windows and are afraid. But the dead come seldom forth, and only at times of great unquiet and coming death, said Éowyn in a low voice. Then why is Aragorn gone that way? Asked Merry. Don't you know anything that would explain it? Unless he spoke in word, said Éomer. None now in the land of the living can tell his purpose. Greatly changed he seemed to me since I saw him first in the king's house, said Éowyn. Grimmer, older, fey I thought him, and like one whom the dead call. Maybe he was called, said Théoden, and my heart tells me that I shall not see him again. Yet he is a kingly man of high destiny, and take comfort in this, daughter, since comfort you seem to need in your grief for this guest. It is said that when the Eolingas came out of the north and passed at length up the Snowbourn, seeking strong places of refuge in the time of need, Brago and his son Baldur climbed the stair of the hold, and so came before the door. On the threshold sat an old man, aged beyond guess of years. Tall and kingly he had been, but now he was withered as an old stone. Indeed for stone they took him, for he moved not, and he said no word, until they sought to pass him by and enter. And then a voice came out of him, as if out of the ground, and to their amaze it spoke in the western tongue. The way is shut. Then they halted and looked at him and saw that he lived still, but he did not look at them. The way is shut, his voice said again. It was made by those who are dead, and the dead keep it until the time comes. The way is shut. And when will that time be? Said Baldur. But no answer did he ever get, for the old man died in that hour and fell upon his face, and no other tidings of the ancient dwellers in the mountains have our folk ever learned. Yet maybe, at last the time foretold has come, and Aragorn may pass. Said Éomer. So great-hearted in this hour of need. Are there not evil things enough abroad without seeking them under the earth? War is at home. He paused. For that moment there was a noise outside. A man's voice crying the name of Théoden and the challenge of the guard. Presently the captain of the guard thrust aside the curtain. He said, "Let him come." A tall man entered, and Merry choked back a cry. For a moment it seemed to him that Boromir was alive again and had returned. Then he saw that it was not so. The man was a stranger, though as like to Boromir as if he were one of his kin, tall and grey-eyed and proud. He was clad as a rider with his cloak of dark green over a coat of fine mail. On the front of his helmet was wrought a small silver star. In his hand he bore a single arrow, black-feathered and barred with steel, but the point was painted red. He sank on one knee and presented the arrow to Théoden. "Friend of Gondor," he said, "Hirgon am I, errand rider of Denethor, who bring you this token of war." Gondor is in great need. Often the Rohirrim have aided us, but now the Lord Denethor asks for all your strength and all your speed, lest Gondor fall at last."
"The Red Arrow," said Théoden, holding it as one who received a summons long expected and yet dreadful when it comes. His hand trembled. "The Red Arrow has not been seen in the mark in all my years. Has it indeed come to that? And what does the Lord Denethor reckon that all my strength and all my speed may be?"
"It is best known to yourself, Lord,"
said Hirgon.
"but ere long it may well come to pass that Minas Tirith is surrounded, and unless you have the strength to break a siege of many powers, the Lord Denethor bids me say that he judges that the strong arms of the Rohirrim would be better within his walls than without. But he knows that we are a people who fight rather upon horseback and in the open, and that we are also scattered people, and time is needed for the gathering of our riders. Is it not true, Hirgon, that the Lord of Minas Tirith knows more than he sets in his message? For we are already at war, as you may have seen, and you do not find us all unprepared. Gandalf the Grey has been among us, and even now we are mustering for battle in the east. The Lord Denethor may know or guess of all these things I cannot say," answered Hirgon. "But indeed our case is desperate. My lord does not issue any command to you. He begs you only to remember old friendship and oaths long spoken, and for your own good, to do all that you may. It is reported to us that many kings have ridden in from the east to the service of Mordor. From the north to the field of Dargolad there is a skirmish and rumor of war. In the south, Haradrim are moving, and fear has fallen on all our coastlands, so that little help will come to us thence. Make haste, for it is before the wars of Minas Tirith that the doom of our time will be decided. And if the tide be not stemmed there, then it will flow over all the fair fields of Rohan, and even in this hold among the hills there shall be no refuge." "Dark tidings," said Théoden, "yet not all unguessed. But say to Denethor that even if Rohan itself felt no peril, still we would come to his aid. But we have suffered much loss in our battles with Saruman the traitor, and we must still think for our frontier to the north and east, as his own tidings make clear. So great a power as the Dark Lord seems now to wield might well contain us in battle before the city, and yet strike with great force across the river, away beyond the Gate of Kings. But we will speak no longer counsels of prudence. We will come. The weapon take was set for the morrow. When all is ordered, we will set out. 10,000 spears I might have sent riding over the plain to the dismay of your foes. It will be less now, I fear, for I will not leave my strongholds all unguarded. Yet 6,000 at the least shall ride behind me. For say to Denethor that in this hour the King of the Mark himself will come down to the land of Gondor, though maybe he will not ride back. But it is a long road, and man and beast must reach the end with strength to fight. A week it may be from the morrow's morn ere you hear the cry of the sons of Eol coming from the north." "A week," said Hirgon. "If it must be so, it must. But you are like to find only ruined walls in 7 days from now, unless other help unlooked for comes. Still, you may at the least disturb the orcs and swarthy men from their feasting in the White Tower." "At the least we will do that," said Théoden. "But I myself am new come from battle and long journey, and I will now go to rest. Tarry here this night. Then you shall look on the muster of Rohan and ride away the gladder for the sight and the swifter for the rest. In the morning counsels are best, and night changes many thoughts." With that the king stood up, and they all rose. "Go now each to your rest," he said, "and sleep well. And you, Master Meriadoc, I need no more tonight. But be ready to my call as soon as the sun is risen." "I will be ready," said Merry. "Even if you bid me ride with you to the pass of the dead." "Speak not words of omen," said the king, "for there may be more roads than one that could bear that name. But I did not say that I would bid you ride with me on any road. Good night." "I won't be left behind to be called for your return," said Merry. "I won't be left. I won't." And repeating this over and over again to himself, he fell asleep at last in his tent. He was wakened by a man shaking him. Wake up, Master Hobbitla," he cried, and at length Merry came out of deep dreams and sat up with a start. It still seemed very dark, he thought. "What's the matter?" he asked. "The king calls for you." But the sun has not risen yet," said Merry. "No, it will not rise this day, Master Hobbitla, nor ever again one would think under this cloud. But time does not stand still, though the sun be lost. Make haste." Flinging on some clothes, Merry looked outside.
The world was darkling. The very air seemed brown, and all things about were black and grey and shadowless. There was a great stillness. No shape or cloud could be seen, unless it were far away westward where the furthest groping fingers of the great gloom still crawled on, and a little light leaked through them. Overhead there hung a heavy roof, sombre and featureless, and light seemed rather to be failing than growing. Mary saw many folk standing, looking up and muttering. All their faces were grey and sad, and some were afraid. With a sinking heart he made his way to the king. Théoden, the rider of Gondor, was there before him, and beside him stood now another man, like him and dressed alike, but shorter and broader. As Merry entered, he was speaking to the king.
"It comes from Mordor, Lord,"
he said.
"It began last night at sunset. From the hills in the eastfold of your realm I saw it rise and creep across the sky, and all night as I rode it came behind, eating up the stars. Now the great cloud hangs over all the land between here and the mountains of shadow, and it is deepening. The war already has begun."
For a while the king sat silent. At last he spoke.
"So we come to it in the end,"
he said.
"The great battle of our time, in which many things shall pass away. But at least there is no longer need for hiding. We will ride the straight way and the open road, and with all our speed. The muster shall begin at once, and wait for none that tarry. Have you good store at Minas Tirith? For if we ride now in all haste, then we must ride light, with but meal and water enough to last us into battle. We have very great store long prepared,"
answered Hirgon.
"Ride now as light and as swift as you may." "Then call the heralds, Eomer,"
said Théoden.
"Let the riders be marshalled."
Eomer went down, and presently the trumpets rang in the hold, and were answered by many others from below. But their voices no longer sounded clear and brave as they had seemed to Merry the night before. Dull they seemed, and harsh in the heavy air, braying ominously. The king turned to Merry.
"I am going to war, Master Meriadoc,"
he said.
"In a little while I shall take the road. I release you from my service, but not from my friendship. You shall abide here, and if you will, you shall serve the Lady Éowyn, who will govern the folk in my stead." But, Lord,"
Merry stammered.
"I offered you my sword. I do not want to be parted from you like this, Théoden King. And as all my friends have gone to the battle, I should be ashamed to stay behind."
But we ride on horses tall and swift," said Théoden.
"And great though your heart be, you cannot ride on such beasts." "Then tie me on the back of one, or let me hang on a stirrup, or something,"
said Merry.
"It is a long way to run, but run I shall if I cannot ride, even if I wear my feet off and arrive weeks too late."
Théoden smiled.
"Rather than that I would bear you with me on Snowmane,"
he said.
"But at the least you shall ride with me to Edoras and look on Meduseld, for that way I shall go. So far Stibba can bear you. The great race will not begin till we reach the plains."
Then Éowyn rose up.
"Come now, Meriadoc,"
she said.
"I will show you the gear that I have prepared for you."
Then they went out together.
"This request only did Aragorn make to me,"
said Éowyn, as they passed among the tents.
"that you should be armed for battle. I have granted it as I could, for my heart tells me that you will need such gear ere the end."
Now she led Merry to a booth among the lodges of the king's guard, and there an armourer brought out to her a small helm, and a round shield, and other gear.
"No mail we have fit for you,"
said Éowyn.
"nor any time for the forging of such hauberk. But here is also a stout jerkin of leather, a belt and a knife. A sword you have."
Merry bowed, and the lady showed him the shield, which was like the shield that had been given to Gimli, and it bore on it the device of a white horse.
"Take all these things,"
she said,
"and bear them to good fortune. Farewell now, Master Meriadoc. It may be we shall meet again, you and I."
So it was amid a gathering gloom the King of the Mark made ready to lead all his riders on the eastward road. Hearts were heavy, and many quailed in the shadow. But they were a stern people, loyal to their lord, and little weeping or murmuring was heard. Even in the camp in the hold, where the exiles from Edoras were housed, women and children and old men. Doom hung over them, but they faced it silently. 2 swift hours passed, and now the king sat upon his white horse, glimmering in the half-light. Proud and tall he seemed, though the hair that flowed beneath his high helm was like snow, and many marvelled at him, and took heart to see him unbent and unafraid. There on the wide flats beside the noisy river were marshalled many companies, well nigh 55 hundreds of riders fully armed, and many hundreds of other men, with spare horses lightly burdened. A single trumpet sounded. The king raised his hand, and then silently the host of the mark began to move. Foremost went 12 of the king's household men, riders of renown. Then the king followed with Eomer on his right. He had said farewell to Eowyn above the hold, and the memory was grievous, but now he turned his mind to the road that lay ahead. Behind him Merry rode on Stibba with the errant riders of Gondor, and behind them again 12 more of the king's household. They passed down the long ranks of waiting men with stern and unmoved faces, but when they had come almost to the end of the line, one looked up, glancing keenly at the Hobbit. A young man, Merry thought as he returned the glance, less in height and girth than most. He caught the glint of clear grey eyes, and then he shivered, for it came suddenly to him that it was the face of one without hope, who goes in search of death. On down the grey road they went beside the snowbourn, rushing on its stones, through the hamlets of Underharrow and Upbourne, where many sad faces of women looked out from dark doors. And so without horn or harp or music of men's voices, the great ride into the east began, with which the songs of Rohan were busy for many long lives of men thereafter. From dark Dunharrow in the dim morning, with Thane and Captain rode Thengil's son. To Edoras he came, the ancient halls of the Mark Wardens mist enshrouded. Golden timbers were in gloom mantled. Farewell he bade to his free people. Hearth and high seat and hallowed places, for the long he had feasted ere the light faded. Forth rode the king, fear behind him, fate before him, fealty kept he. Oaths he had taken, all fulfilled them. Forth rode Théoden, 5 nights and days, eastward and onward rode the Eorlingas, through Fold and Fenmarch and the Firian wood. 6,000 spears to Sunoding, Mundburg the mighty under Mindoluin, Sea King's city in the South Kingdom. Foe beleaguered and fire encircled. Doom drove them on, darkness took them. Horse and horseman, hoofbeats afar, sank into silence. So the songs tell us. It was indeed in deeping gloom that the king came to Edoras, although it was then but noon by the hour. There he halted only a short while, and strengthened his host by some 60 of riders that came late to the waggon-take. Now, having eaten, he made ready to set out again, and he wished his esquire a kindly farewell. But Merry begged for the last time not to be parted from him.
"This is no journey for such steeds as Stibba, as I have told you,"
said Théoden.
"And in such a battle as we think to make on the fields of Gondor, what would you do, Master Meriadoc, sore thane though you be, and greater of heart than of stature?" "As for that, who can tell?"
answered Merry.
But why, Lord, did you receive me as a sore thane if not to stay by your side? And I would not have it said to me in song only that I was always left behind."
"I received you for your safe keeping," answered Théoden.
"And also to do as I might bid. None of my riders can bear you as a burden. If the battle were before my gates, maybe your deeds would be remembered by the minstrels. But it is 100 leagues and 2 to Mundburg, where Denethor is lord. I will say no more."
Merry bowed and went away unhappily, and stared at the lines of horsemen. Already the companies were preparing to start. Men were tightening girths, looking to saddles, caressing their horses. Some gazed uneasily at the lowering sky. Unnoticed, a rider came up and spoke softly in the Hobbit's ear.
"Where will Onslaught a way open, so we say?"
he whispered.
"And so I have found myself."
Merry looked up and saw that it was the young rider whom he had noticed in the morning.
"You wish to go whither the Lord of the Mark goes?"
"I see it in your face."
"I do. Then you shall go with me,"
said the rider.
"I will bear you before me under my cloak until we are far afield. And this darkness is yet darker. Such goodwill should not be denied. Say no more to any man, but come." "Thank you indeed,"
said Merry.
"Thank you, sir, though I do not know your name." do you not?
said the rider softly.
Then call me Danhelm.
Thus it came to pass that when the king set out, before Denhelm sat Meriadoc the Hobbit, and the great grey steed Windfalla made little of the burden, for Denhelm was less in weight than many men, though lithe and well knit in frame. On into the shadow they rode, in the willow thickets where Snowborn flowed into the Entwash. 12 leagues east of Edros they camped that night, and then on again through the fold, and through the fen march where, to their right, great oak woods climbed on the skirts of the hills, under the shades of dark Halifirian by the borders of Gondor. But away to their left, the mists lay on the marshes, fed by the mouths of Entwash. And as they rode, rumour came of war in the north. Lone men riding wild brought word of foes assailing their east borders, of orc hosts marching in the wold of Rohan.
"Ride on! Ride on!"
cried Eomer.
"Too late now to turn aside. The friends of Entwash must guard our flank. Haste now we need! Ride on!"
And so King Théoden departed from his own realm, and mile by mile the long road wound away, and the beacon hills marched past. Calenhad, Minrimon, Erelas, Nardo. But their fires were quenched. All the lands were grey and still, and ever the shadow deepened before them, and hope waned in every heart. Pippin was roused by Gandalf. Candles were lit near their chamber, for only a dim twilight came through the windows. The air was heavy as with approaching thunder.
What is the time?
Said Pippin, yawning. Said Gandalf.
Time to get up and make yourself learn your new duties.
Will he provide breakfast?
No, I have provided it. All that you will get till noon. Food is now doled out by order.
Pippin looked ruefully at the small loaf, and, he thought, very inadequate pat of butter which was set out for him, beside a cup of thin milk.
Why did you bring me here?
You know quite well,
said Gandalf.
to keep you out of mischief. And if you do not like being here, you can remember that you brought it on yourself.
Pippin said no more. Before long he was walking with Gandalf once more down the cold corridor to the door of the Tower Hall. There Denethor sat in a grey gloom, like an old, patient spider, Pippin thought. He did not seem to have moved since the day before. He beckoned Gandalf to a seat, but Pippin was left for a while standing unheeded. Presently the old man turned to him.
Well, Master Peregrine, I hope that you used yesterday to your profit and to your liking. Though I fear that the board is barer in this city than you could wish.
Pippin had an uncomfortable feeling that most of what he had said or done was somehow known to the lord of the city, and much was guessed of what he thought as well. He did not answer.
What would you do in my service?
I thought, sir, that you would tell me my duties.
I will when I learn what you are fit for,
said Denethor.
But that I shall learn soonest, maybe, if I keep you beside me. The esquire of my chamber has begged leave to go to the out garrison, so you shall take his place for a while. You shall wait on me, bear errands, and talk to me, if war and counsel leave me any leisure. Can you sing?
Yes.
Said Pippin.
Well, yes. Well enough for my own people. But we have no songs fit for great halls and evil times, Lord. We seldom sing of anything more terrible than wind or rain. And most of my songs are about things that make us laugh. Or about food and drink, of course.
And why would such songs be unfit for my halls, or such hours as these? We who have lived long under the shadow may surely listen to echoes from a land untroubled by it. Then we may feel that our vigil was not fruitless, though it may have been thankless.
Pippin's heart sank. He did not relish the idea of singing any song of the Shire to the Lord of Minas Tirith. Certainly not the comic ones that he knew best. They were too, well, rustic for such an occasion. He was, however, spared the ordeal for the present. He was not commanded to sing. Denethor turned to Gandalf, asking questions about the Rohirrim and their policies. In the position of Eomer, the king's nephew, Pippin marvelled at the amount that the lords seemed to know about a people that lived far away, though it must, he thought, be many years since Denethor himself had ridden abroad. Presently Denethor waved to Pippin and dismissed him again for a while.
Go to the armories of the citadel,
He said,
and get you there the livery and gear of the tower. It will be ready. It was commanded yesterday. Return when you are clad.
It was as he said, and Pippin soon found himself arrayed in strange garments, all of black and silver. He had a small hauberk, its rings forged of steel maybe, yet black as jet, and a high-crowned helm with small raven wings on either side, set with a silver star in the centre of the circlet. Above the mail was a short surcoat of black, but broidered on the breast in silver with the token of the tree. His old clothes were folded and put away, but he was permitted to keep the grey cloak of Lorien, though not to wear it when on duty. He looked now, had he known it, very Ernil y Ferianath, the prince of the halflings, that folk had called him. But he felt uncomfortable, and the gloom began to weigh on his spirits. It was dark and dim all day. From the sunless dawn until evening, the heavy shadow had deepened, and all hearts in the city were oppressed. Far above, a great cloud streamed slowly westward from the black land, devouring light, borne upon a wind of war. But below, the air was still and breathless, as if all the Vale of Anduin waited for the onset of a ruinous storm. About the 11th hour, released at last for a while from service, Pippin came out and went in search for food and drink to cheer his heavy heart and make his task of waiting more supportable. In the messes he met Beregond again, who had just come from an errand over the Pelennor out to the guard towers upon the causeway. Together they strolled out to the walls, for Pippin felt imprisoned indoors and stifled even in the lofty citadel. Now they sat side by side again in the embrasure looking eastward, where they had eaten and talked the day before. It was the sunset hour, but the great pall had now stretched far into the west, and only as it sank at last into the sea did the sun escape to send out a brief farewell gleam before the night, even as Frodo saw it at the crossroads touching the head of the fallen king. But to the fields of the Pelennor, under the shadow of Mindolluin, there came no gleam. They were brown and drear. Already it seemed years to Pippin since he had sat there before, in some half-forgotten time where he had still been a hobbit, a light-hearted wanderer touched little by the perils that he had passed through. Now he was one small soldier in a city preparing for a great assault, clad in the proud but sombre manner of the Tower of Guard. In some other time and place, Pippin might have been pleased with his new array, but he knew now that he was taking part in no play. He was in deadly earnest the servant of a grim master in the greatest peril. The hauberk was burdensome, and the helm weighed upon his head. His cloak he had cast aside upon the seat. He turned his tired gaze away from the darkling fields below and yawned, and then he sighed.
You are weary of this day?
Said Beregond.
Yes,
Said Pippin.
very. Tired out with the idleness and waiting. I've kicked my heels at the door of my master's chamber for many slow hours, while he has debated with Gandalf and the prince and other great persons. And I'm not used, Master Beregond, to waiting hungry on others while they eat. It is a sore trial for a hobbit, that. No doubt you would think I should feel the honour more deeply. But what is the good of such honour? Indeed, what is the good even of food and drink under this creeping shadow? What does it mean? The very air seems thick and brown. Do you often have such glooms when the wind is in the east?
Nay,
Said
this is no weather of the world. This is some service of his malice. some broil of fume from the mountain of fire that he sends to darken hearts in council. And so it doth indeed. I wish the Lord Faramir would return. He would not be dismayed. But now, who knows if he will ever come back across the river out of the darkness.
Yes, said Pippin. Gandalf too is anxious. He was disappointed, I think, not to find Faramir here. And where has he got himself? He left the Lord's Council before the noon meal, and in no good mood either, I thought. Perhaps he has some foreboding of bad news. Suddenly, as they talked, they were stricken dumb, frozen as it were to listening stones. Pippin cowered down with his hands pressed to his ears, but Beregond, who had been looking out from the battlement as he spoke of Faramir, remained there. Stiffened, staring out with starting eyes. Pippin knew the shuddering cry that he had heard. It was the same that he had heard long ago in the Marish of the Shire, but now it has grown in power and hatred, piercing the heart with a poisonous despair. At last Beregond spoke with an effort.
They have come, he said. Take courage and look. There are fell things below.
Reluctantly Pippin climbed onto the seat and looked out over the wall. The Pelennor lay dim beneath him, fading away to the scarce-guessed line of the great river. But now, wheeling swiftly across it, like shadows of untimely night, he saw in the middle airs below him 5 bird-like forms, horrible as carrion fowl, yet greater than eagles, cruel as death. Now they swooped near, venturing almost within bowshot of the walls. Now they circled away.
Black Riders,
muttered Pippin.
Black Riders of the air! See, Beregond,
He cried.
they are looking for something, surely. See how they wheel and swoop, always down to that point over there. And can you see something moving on the ground? Dark little things. Yes. Men on horses. 4 or 5. I cannot stand it! Gandalf! Gandalf, save us!
Another long screech rose and fell, and he threw himself back again from the wall, panting like a hunted animal. Faint and seemingly remote, through that shuddering cry he heard winding up from below the sound of a trumpet ending on a long high note.
Faramir! Lord Faramir! That is his call!
Cried Beregond.
Brave heart! But how can he win to the gate if these foul hell hawks have other weapons than fear? But look! They hold on! They will make the gate! No, the horses are running mad! Look, the men are thrown! They are running on foot! No, one is still up, but he rides back to the others. That will be the captain. He can master both beasts and men. Ah! There, one of the foul things is swooping on him. Help! Will no one go out to him?
With that, Beregond sprang away and ran off into the gloom, ashamed of his terror, while Beregond of the guard thought first of the captain whom he loved. Pippin got up and peered out. At that moment he caught a flash of white and silver coming from the north, like a small star down on the dusky fields. It moved with the speed of an arrow and grew as it came, converging swiftly with the flight of the 4 men towards the gate. It seemed to Pippin that a pale light was spread about it, and the heavy shadows gave way before it. And then as it drew near, he thought that he heard, like an echo in the walls, a great voice calling.
Gandalf!
He cried.
Gandalf! He always turns up when things are darkest. Go on! Go on, Right Rider! Gandalf! Gandalf!
He shouted wildly, like an onlooker at a great race, urging on a runner who is far beyond encouragement. But now the dark swooping shadows were aware of the newcomer. One wheeled towards him, but it seemed to Pippin that he raised his hand, and from it a shaft of white light stabbed upwards. The Nazgul gave a long wailing cry and swerved away. And with that the 4 others wavered, and then rising in swift spirals they passed away eastward, vanishing into the lowering cloud above. And down on the Pelennor it seemed for a while less dark. Pippin watched, and he saw the horsemen and the White Rider meet and halt, waiting for those on foot. Men now hurried out to them from the city, and soon they all passed from sight under the outer walls, and he knew that they were entering the gate. Guessing that they would come at once to the tower and the steward, he hurried to the entrance of the citadel. There he was joined by many others who had watched the race and the rescue from the high walls. It was not long before a clamour was heard in the streets leading up from the circles.
It was dark, and Merry could see nothing as he lay on the ground rolled in a blanket. Yet, though the night was airless and windless all about him, hidden trees were sighing softly. He lifted his head. Then he heard it again, a sound like faint drums in the wooded hills and mountain steppes. The throb would increase suddenly and then be taken up again at some other point, now nearer, now further off. He wondered if the watchmen had heard it. He could not see them, but he knew that all around him were the companies of the Rohirrim. He could smell the horses in the dark, and could hear the shiftings and their soft stamping on the needle-covered ground. The host was bivouacked in the pine woods that clustered about Eilenach Beacon, a tall hill standing up from the long ridges of the Druidan forest
that lay beside the great road in East Anurian.
Tired as he was, Merry could not sleep. He had ridden now for 4 days on end, and the ever-deepening gloom had slowly weighed down on his heart. He began to wonder why he had been so eager to come, when he had been given every excuse, even his lord's command, to stay behind. He wondered, too, if the old king knew that he had been disobeyed and was angry. Perhaps not. There seemed to be some understanding between Dernhelm and Elfhelm, the marshal who commanded the Eored in which they were riding. He and all his men ignored Merry and pretended not to hear if he spoke. He might have been just another bag that Dernhelm was carrying. Dernhelm was no comfort. He never spoke to anyone. Merry felt small, unwanted, and lonely. Now the time was anxious, and the host was in peril. They were less than a day's ride from the outwalls of Minas Tirith that encircled the townlands. Scouts had been sent ahead. Some had not returned. Others, hastening back, had reported that the road was held in force against them. A host of the enemy was encamped upon it, 3 miles west of Amondine, and some strength of men was already thrusting along the road and was no more than 3 leagues away. Orcs were roving in the hills and woods along the roadside. The king and Eomer held council in the watches of the night. Merry wanted somebody to talk to, and he thought of Pippin. But that only increased his restlessness. Poor Pippin, shut up in the great city of stone, lonely and afraid. Merry wished he was the tall rider, like Eomer, and could blow a horn or something and go galloping to his rescue. He sat up listening to the drums that were beating again, now nearer at hand. Presently he heard voices speaking low, and he saw dim, half-shrouded lanterns passing through the trees. Men nearby began to move uncertainly in the dark. A tall figure loomed up and stumbled over him, cursing the tree roots. He recognized the voice of the marshal, Elfhelm.
"I'm not a tree root, sir,"
he said.
"nor a bag, but a bruised hobbit. The least you can do in amends is to tell me what is afoot." "Anything that can keep so in this devil's murk,"
answered Elfhelm.
"but my lord sends word that we must set ourselves in readiness. Orders may come for a sudden move." "Is the enemy coming then?"
asked Merry anxiously.
"Are those your drums?" "I began to think that I was imagining them, as no one else seemed to take any notice of them."
Nay, nay," said Elfhelm.
"The enemy is on the road, not in the hills. You hear the wozes, the wild men of the woods. Thus they talk together, from afar. They still haunt Druidan forest, it is said. Remnants of an older time they be, living few and secretly wild and wary as the beasts. They go not to war with Gondor or the Mark, but now they are troubled by the darkness and the coming of the orcs. They fear lest the dark years be returning, as seems likely enough. Let us be thankful that they are not hunting us, for they use poisoned arrows, it is said, and they are woodcrafty beyond compare. But they have offered their services to Théoden. Even now one of their headmen is being taken to the king. Yonder go the lights. So much I have heard, but no more. And now I must busy myself with my lord's commands. Pack yourself up, Master Bag."
He vanished into the shadows. Merry did not like this talk of wild men and poisoned darts, but quite apart from that, a great weight of dread was on him. Waiting was unbearable. He longed to know what was going to happen. He got up, and soon was walking warily in pursuit of the last lantern before it disappeared among the trees. Presently he came to an open space, where a small tent had been set up for the king under a great tree. A large lantern, covered above
was hanging from a bow and cast a pale circle of light yellow. There sat Théoden and Éomer, and before them on the ground sat a strange, squat shape of a man, gnarled as an old stone, and the hairs of his scanty beard straggled on his lumpy chin like dry moss. He was short-legged and fat-armed, thick and stumpy, and clad only with grass about his waist. Merry felt that he had seen him before somewhere, and suddenly he remembered the Pukul men of Dunharrow. Here was one of those old images brought to life, or maybe a creature descended in true line through endless years from the models used by the forgotten craftsmen long ago. There was a silence as Merry crept nearer, and then the wild man began to speak, in answer to some question it seemed. His voice was deep and guttural, yet to Merry's surprise, he spoke the common speech, though in a halting fashion, and uncouth words were mingled with it.
"No, father of horsemen,"
he said.
"we fight not. Hunt only. Kill Gogun in woods. Hate orc folk. You hate Gogun too. We help as we can. Wild men have long ears and long eyes. No hot paths. Wild men live here, before stone houses, before tall men come up out of water.
But our need is for aid in battle. How will you and your folk help us?"
Pudding news,
said the wild man.
"We look out from hills. We climb big mountain and look down. Stone city shut. Fire burns there outside. Now inside too. You wish to come here? Then you must be quick. But Gorgon and men out of far away.
He waved a short gnarled arm eastward.
Sit on horse road. Very many. More than horsemen."
How do you know that?
Said Éomer. The old man's flat face and dark eyes showed nothing, but his voice was sullen with displeasure.
"Wild men are wild, free, but not children,"
he answered.
"I am great headman. Han Puri Han. I count many things. Stars in sky, leaves on trees, men in the dark. You have a score of scores counted 10 times in 5. They have more. Big fight. And who will win? And many more walk round walls of stone houses."
Alas, he speaks all too shrewdly,
said Théoden.
and our scouts say that they have cast trenches and stakes across the road. We cannot sweep them away in sudden onset.
And yet we need great haste,
said Éomer.
Mundburg is on
"Let
fire.
Han Puri Han finish."
Said the wild man.
"More than one road he knows. He will lead you by road where no pits are, no Gogun walk, only wild men and beasts. Many paths were made when Stonehouse folk were stronger. They carved hills as hunters carve beast flesh. Wild men think they ate stone for food. They went through Dragash to Rimon with great rains. They go no longer. The road is forgotten, but not by wild men. Over hill and behind it lies still under grass and tree. There, behind Rimon and down to Dane and back at the end to Horseman's Road. Wild men will show you that road. Then you kill Gorgon and drive away bad dog with bright iron, and wild men can go back to sleep in the wild woods.
Éomer and the king spoke together in their own tongue. At length, Théoden turned to the wild man.
We will receive your offer.
He said,
For though we leave a host of foes behind, what matter? If the stone city falls, then we shall have no returning. If it is saved, then the orc host itself will be cut off. If you are faithful, Han Buri Han, then we will give you rich reward, and you shall have the friendship of the Mark forever.
Dead men are not friends to living men, and give them no gifts.
said the wild man.
But if you live after the darkness, then leave wild men alone in the woods, and do not hunt them like beasts anymore. Han Buri Han will not lead you into trap. He will go himself, with father of horsemen. And if he leads you wrong, you will kill him.
So be it.
Said Théoden.
How long will it take to pass the enemy and come back to the road?
asked Eomer.
We must go a foot pace if you guide us, and I doubt not the way is narrow.
Wild men go quick on feet.
Said Han.
Way is wide for 4 horses in Stonewain Valley yonder.
He waved his hand southwards.
But narrow at beginning and at end. Wild men could walk from here to Dean between sunrise and noon.
Then we must allow at least 7 hours for the leaders.
Said Eomer.
But we must reckon rather on some 10 hours for all. Things unforeseen may hinder us, and if our host is all stung out, it will be long ere it can be set in order when we issue from the hills. What is the hour now?
Who knows?
Said Théoden.
It is all dark, but it is not all night.
Said Han.
When sun comes, we feel her, even when she is hidden. Already she climbs over east mountains. It is the opening of day in the sky fields.
Then we must set out as soon as may be.
Said Eomer.
Even so, we cannot hope to come to Gondor's aid today.
Merry waited to hear no more, but slipped away to get ready for the summons to the march. This was the last stage before the battle. It did not seem likely to him that any of them would survive it, but he thought of Pippin, and the flames in Minas Tirith, and thrust down his own dread. All went well that day, and no sign or sound had they of the enemy waiting to waylay them. The wild men had put on a screen of wary hunters, so that no orc-roving spy should learn the movements in the hills. The light was more dim than ever as they drew nearer to the beleaguered city. The riders passed in long files like dark shadows of men and horses. Each company was guided by a wild woodman, but old Han walked beside the king. The start had been slower than was hoped, for it had taken time for the riders, walking and leading their horses, to find paths over the sticky wooden ridges behind their camp, and down into the hidden Stonewain Valley. It was late in the afternoon when the leaders came to wide grey thickets stretching beyond the eastward side of Amondine, and masking a great gap in the line of hills that from Nador to Dean ran east and west. Through the gap the forgotten Wain road long ago had run down, back into the main horseway from the city, through Anurian. But now, for many lives of men, trees had had their way with it, and it had vanished, broken and buried under the leaves of uncounted years. But the thickets offered to the riders their last hope of cover before they went into open battle, for beyond them lay the road and the plains of Anduin, while east and southwards the slopes were bare and rocky. As the writhen hills gathered themselves together and climbed up, bastion upon bastion, into the great mass and shoulders of Mindoluin, the leading company was halted. And as those behind filed up out of the trough of the Stonewain Valley, they spread out and passed to camping places under the grey trees. The king summoned the captains to council. Eomer set out scouts to spy upon the road, but old Khan shook his head.
No good sending horsemen,
he said.
Wild men have already seen all that can be seen in the bad air. They will come soon and speak to me here.
The captains came, and then out of the trees crept wearily other pukel shapes, so like old Khan that Merry could hardly tell them apart. They spoke to Khan in a strange, throaty language. Presently Khan turned to the king.
Wild men say many things,
he said.
First, be wary. Still many men in camp beyond Dean. An hour's walk yonder.
He waved his arm west towards the black beacon.
But none to see between here and Stonefolk's new walls. Many busy there. Walls stand up no longer. Gorgun knocked them down with earth thunder, and with clubs and black iron. They are unwary and do not look about them. They think their friends watch all roads.
At that, old Khan made a curious gurgling noise, and it seemed that he was laughing.
Good tidings,
cried Eomer.
Even in this gloom, hope gleams again. Our enemy's devices often serve us in his despite. The accursed darkness itself has been a cloak to us, and now, lusting to destroy Gondor and throw it down stone for stone, his orcs have taken away my greatest fear. The outwall could have been held long against us. Now we can sweep through, if once we win so far.
Once again, I think, Han Burihan of the Woods,
said Théoden.
Good fortune go with you for tidings and for guidance.
Kill Gorgun. Kill orc folk. No other words, please, wild men,
answered Khan.
Drive away bad air and darkness with bright iron.
To do these things we have ridden far,
said the king.
and we shall attempt them.
but what we shall achieve only tomorrow will show. Khan Budi Khan squatted down and touched the earth with his horny brow in token of farewell. Then he got up as if to depart, but suddenly he stood looking up like some startled woodland animal, snuffling a strange air. A light came in his eyes.
It's changing!
He cried, and with that, in a twinkling as it seemed, he and his fellows had vanished into the glooms, never to be seen by any rider of Rohan again. Not long after, far away eastward, the faint drums throbbed again. Yet to no heart in all the host came any fear that the wild men were unfaithful, strange and unlovely though they might appear. Said Elfhelm,
I, for one. When we come to the road, it will veer south, and there will lie before us still 7 leagues ere we reach the wall of the Talmans. Along most of that way there is much grass on either side of the road. On that stretch the Arryn riders of Gondor reckon to make the greater speed. We may ride it swiftly without great wound.
Then, since we look for fell deeds and in the need of all our strength, said Eomer, I counsel that we rest now, and set out hence by night. And so time our going that we come upon the fields when tomorrow is as light as it will be, or when our lord gives the signal.
To this the king assented, and the captains departed. But soon Elfhelm returned. He said,
Save 2 men only. 2 dead men and 2 dead horses.
Well,
said Eomer,
what of it?
This lord, they were Arryn riders of Gondor. Hirgon was one, maybe. At least his hand still clasped the red arrow. But his head was hewn off. And this also. It would seem that the signs that they were fleeing westward when they fell. As I had read it, they found the enemy already on the outwall or assailing it when they returned. That would be 2 nights ago if they used fresh horses from their posts, as they won't. They could not reach the city and turn back.
Alas,
said Théoden,
Then Denethor has heard no news of our riding, and will despair of our coming.
need brooks no delay, yet late is better than never.
said Eomer.
And mayhap in this time shall the old say be proved truer than ever before since men spoke with mouth.
It was night. On either side of the road, the host of Rohan was moving silently. Now the road, passing about the skirts of Mindoluin, turned southward. Far away and almost straight ahead, there was a red glow under the black sky of the sides of the great mountain, loomed dark against it. They were drawing near the Ramas of the Pelennor, but the day was not yet come. The king rode in the midst of the leading company, his household men about him. Elfhelm's Eored came next, and now Merry noticed that Danhelm had left his place, and in the darkness was moving steadily forward, until at last he was riding, just in rear of the king's guard. There came a check. Merry heard voices in front speaking softly. Outriders had come back, who had ventured forward almost to the wall. They came to the king.
There are great fires, lord.
Said one,
The city's all set about with flame, and the field is full of foes. But all seem drawn off to the assault. As well as we could guess, there are few left upon the outwall. And they are heedless, busy with destruction. Do you remember the Wild Man's words, lord?
said another.
I live upon the open wold in days of peace. Windfire is my name, and to me also the air brings messages. Already the wind is turning. There comes a breath out of the south. There is a sea tang in it, faint though it be. The morning will bring new things. Above the reek it will be drawn when you pass the wall. If you speak truly, Windfire, then may you live beyond this day in years of blessedness,
said Théoden. He turned to the men of his household who were near, and spoke now in a clear voice, so that many also of the riders of the first Eored heard him.
Now is the hour come, riders of the mark, sons of Eorl! Foes and fire before you, and your homes far behind. The glory that you reap there shall be your own forever. Oaths ye have taken, now fulfill them all, to lord and land, and league of friendship.
Men clashed spear upon shield,
Eomer, my son, you lead the first Eored,
said Théoden.
and it shall go behind the king's banner in the centre. Elfhelm, lead your company to the right when we pass the wall, and Grimbold shall lead his towards the left. Let the other companies behind follow these 3 that lead, as they have chance. Strike wherever the enemy gathers. Other plans we cannot make, for we know not yet how things stand upon the field. Forth now, and fear no darkness.
The leading company rode off as swiftly as they could, for it was still deep dark, whatever change Windfire might forebode. Merry was riding behind Downhill, clutching with the left hand, while with the other he tried to loosen his sword in his sheath. He felt now bitterly the truth of the old king's words. In such a battle, what do you do, Meriadoc?
Just this,
He thought.
encumber a rider and hope that best to stay my seat and not be pounded to death by galloping hoofs.
It was no more than a league where the outwalls had stood. They soon reached them, too soon for Merry. Wild cries broke out, and there was some clash of arms, but it was brief. The orcs busy about the walls were few and amazed, and they were quickly slain or driven off. Before the ruin of the north gate in the Ramas, the king halted again. The first Eored drew up behind him, and about him on either side. Dernhelm kept close to the king, though Elfhelm's company was away on the right. Grimbold's men turned aside, and passed round to a great gap in the wall further eastward. Merry peered from behind Dernhelm's back. Far away, maybe 10 miles or more, there was a great burning, but between it and the riders' lines of fire blazed in a vast crescent, at the nearest point less than a league distant. He could make out little more on the dark plain, and as yet he neither saw any hope of morning, nor felt any wind, changed or unchanged. Now silently the host of Rohan moved forward into the field of Gondor, pouring in slowly but steadily, like the rising tide through breaches in a dike that men have thought secure. But the mind and will of the Black Captain were bent wholly on the falling city. As yet no tidings came to him warning that his designs held any flaw. After a while the king led his men away somewhat eastward to come between the fires of the siege and the outer fields. Still they were unchallenged, and still Théoden gave no signal. At last he halted once again. The city was now nearer. A smell of burning was in the air, and a very shadow of death. The horses were uneasy, but the king sat upon Snowmane, motionless, gazing upon the agony of Minas Tirith, as if stricken suddenly by anguish or by dread. He seemed to shrink down, cowed by age. Merry himself felt as if a great weight of horror and doubt had settled on him. His heart beat slowly. Time seemed poised in uncertainty. They were too late. Too late was worse than never. Perhaps Théoden would quail, bow his old head, turn, slink away to hide in the hills. Then suddenly, Merry felt it at last, beyond doubt, a change. Wind was in his face, light was glimmering. Far, far away in the south, the clouds could be dimly seen as remote grey shapes, rolling up, drifting. Morning lay beyond them. But at that same moment, there was a flash, as if lightning had sprung from the earth beneath the city. For a searing second it stood dazzling far off in black and white, its topmost tower like a glittering needle. And then, as the darkness closed again, there came rolling over the fields a great boom. At that sound, the bent shape of the king sprang suddenly erect. Tall and proud he seemed again, and rising in his stirrups, he cried in a loud voice, more clear than any there had ever heard a mortal man achieve before.
Arise! Arise! Riders of Théoden! Tail deeds awake! Fire and slaughter! Spear shall be shaken! Shields be splintered! A sword day! A red day! Ere the sun rises! Right now! Right now! Right to Gondor!
With that, he seized a great horn from Guthlaf, his banner-bearer, and blew such a blast upon it that it burst asunder. And straightway all the horns in the host were lifted up in music, and the blowing of the horns of Rohan in that hour was like a storm upon the plain and a thunder in the mountains.
Right now! Right now! Right to Gondor!
Suddenly the king cried to Snowmane, and the horse sprang away. Behind him his banner blew in the wind. White horse upon a field of green, but he outpaced it. After him thundered the knights of his house, but he was ever before them. Eomer rode there, the white horsetail of his helm floating in his speed, and the front of the first Eored roared like a breaker foaming in the shore. But Théoden could not be overtaken. Fey he seemed, for the battle fury of his fathers ran like new Tyre in his veins. And he was borne up on Snowmane like a god of old, even as Orome the Great, in the battle of the Valar when the world was young. His golden shield was uncovered, and lo, it shone like an image of the sun, and the grass flamed into green about the white feet of his steed. For morning came, morning and a wind from the sea, and the darkness was removed, and the hosts of Mordor wailed, and terror took them, and they fled, and died, and the hooves of wrath rode over them. And then all the host of Rohan burst into song, and they sang as they slew. And the joy of battle was on them, and the sound of their singing that was fair and terrible came even to the city. But it was no orc chieftain or brigand that led the assault upon Gondor. The darkness was breaking too soon, before the date that his master had set for it. Fortune had betrayed him for the moment, and the world had turned against him. Victory was slipping from his grasp, even as he stretched out his hand to seize it. But his arm was long. He was still in command, wielding great powers. King, Ringwraith, Lord of the Nazgul, he had many weapons. He left the gate and vanished. Théoden, king of the Mark, had reached the road from the gate to the river, and he returned towards the city that was now less than a mile distant. He slackened his speed a little, seeking new foes, and his knights came about him, and Dernhelm was with them. Ahead, nearer the walls of Elfhelm's men, were among the siege engines hewing, slaying, driving their foes into the fire pits. Well nigh all the northern half of the Pelennor was overrun, and there camps were blazing. Orcs were flying towards the river like herds before the hunters, and the Rohirrim went hither and thither at their will. But they had not yet overthrown the siege nor won the gate. Many foes stood before it, and on the further half of the plain were other hosts still unfought. Southward beyond the road lay the main force of the Haradrim, and there their horsemen were gathered about the standard of their chieftain. And he looked out, and in the growing light he saw the banner of the king, and that it was far ahead of the battle with few men about it. Then he was filled with a red wrath, and shouted aloud, and displaying his standard, black serpent upon scarlet, he came against the white horse and the green with great press of men, and the drawing of the scimitars of the Southrons was like a glitter of stars. Then Théoden was aware of him, and would not wait for his onset, but crying to Snowmane he charged headlong to greet him. Great was the clash of their meeting, but the white fury of the northern burned the hotter, and more skilled was their knighthood with long spears and bitter. Fewer were they, but they clove through the Southrons like a firebolt in the forest. Right through the crest drove Théoden, Thengel's son, and his spear was shivered as he threw down their chieftain. Out swept his sword, and he spurred to the standard, hewed staff and bearer, and the black serpent thundered. Then all that was left unslain of their cavalry turned and fled far away. But lo, suddenly in the midst of the glory of the king his golden shield was dimmed. The new morning was blotted from the sky. Dark fell about him. Horses reared and screamed. Men cast from the saddle lay grovelling on the ground.
To me!
Cried Théoden.
Up, Eorlingus! Fear no darkness!
But Snowmane, wild with terror, stood up on high, fighting with the air, and then with a great scream he crashed upon his side. A black dart had pierced him. The king fell beneath him. The great shadow descended like a falling cloud, and behold, it was a winged creature, if bird, then greater than all other birds, and it was naked, and neither quill nor feather did it bear, and its vast pinions were as webs of hide between horned fingers, and it stank. A creature of an old world maybe it was, whose kind, lingering in forgotten mountains cold beneath the moon, outstayed their day. And in hideous eyrie bred this last untimely brood, apt to evil, and the Dark Lord took it, and nursed it with fell meats, until it grew beyond the measure of all other things that fly. And he gave it to his servant, to be his steed. Down, down it came, and then, folding its fingered webs, it gave a croaking cry, and settled upon the body of Snowmane, digging in its claws, stooping its long, naked neck. Upon it sat a shape, black-mantled, huge and threatening. A crown of steel he bore, but between rim and robe naught was there to see, save only a deadly gleam of eyes. The Lord of the Nazgul. To the air he had returned, summoning his steed ere the darkness failed, and now he has come again, bringing ruin, turning hope to despair, and victory to death. A great black mace he wielded. But Théoden was not utterly forsaken. The knights of his house lay slain about him, or else mastered by the madness of their steeds were borne far away. Yet one stood there still, Dernhelm the Young, faithful beyond fear, and he wept, for he had loved his lord as a father. Right through the charge, Merry had been borne unharmed behind him, until the shadow came, and when Windfaller had thrown them in his terror, and now ran wild upon the plain, Merry crawled on all fours like a dazed beast, and such a horror was on him that he was blind and sick.
Kingsman! Kingsman!
His heart cried within him.
You must stay by him. As a father you shall be to me, you said.
But his will made no answer, and his body shook. He dared not open his eyes or look up. Then, out of the blackness in his mind, he thought that he heard Dernhelm speaking. Yet now the voice seemed strange, recalling some other voice that he had known.
Begone, foul Gwymalake, Lord of Carrion! Leave the dead in peace!
A cold voice answered.
Come not between the Nazgul and his prey, or he will not slay thee in thy turn. He will bear thee away to the houses of lamentation, beyond all darkness, where thy flesh shall be devoured, and thy shriveled mind be left to the lidless eye.
A sword rang as it was drawn.
Do what you will! But I will hinder it if I may!
Hinder me, thou fool. No living man may hinder me.
Then Merry heard of all sounds in that hour the strangest. It seemed that Dernhelm laughed, and the clear voice was like the ring of steel.
But no living man am I! You look upon a woman. Eowyn I am, Eormund's daughter. You stand between me and my lord and kin. Begone! If you be not deathless. For living or dark undead, I will smite you if you touch him!
The winged creature screamed at her, but the ringwraith made no answer, and was silent, as if in sudden doubt. Very amazement for a moment conquered Merry's fear. He opened his eyes, and the blackness was lifted from them. There, some paces from him, sat the great beast, and all seemed dark about it, and above it loomed the Nazgul Lord like a shadow of despair. A little to the left facing them stood she whom he had called Dernhelm, but the helm of her secrecy had fallen from her, and her bright hair, released from its bonds, gleamed with pale gold upon her shoulders. Her eyes, grey as the sea, were hard and fell, and yet tears were on her cheek. A sword was in her hand, and she raised her shield against the horror of her enemy's eyes. Eowyn it was, and Dernhelm also, for into Merry's mind flashed the memory of the face that he saw at the riding from Dunharrow, the face of one that goes seeking death, having no hope. Pity filled his heart, and great wonder, and suddenly the snow-kindled courage of his race awoke. He clenched his hand. She could not die. So fair, so desperate. At least she could not die alone, unaided. The face of their enemy was not turned towards him, but still he hardly dared to move, dreading lest the deadly eyes should fall on him. Slowly he began to crawl aside, but the black captain, in doubt and malice intent upon the woman before him, heeded him no more than a worm in the mud. Suddenly the great beast beat its hideous wings, and the wind of them was foul. Again it leapt into the air, and then swiftly fell down upon Éowyn, shrieking, striking with beak and claw. Still she did not blench, maiden of the Rohirrim, child of kings, slender but as a steel blade, fair but terrible. A swift stroke she dealt, skilled and deadly. The outstretched neck she cloved asunder, and the hewn head fell like a stone. Backward she sprang as the huge shape crashed into ruin, vast wings outspread, crumpled on the earth. And with its fall the shadow passed away. A light fell about her, and her hair shone in the sunrise. Out of the wreck rose the Black Rider, tall and menacing, towering above her. With a cry of hatred that stung the very ears like venom, he let fall his mace. Her shield was shriveled in many pieces, and her arm was broken. She stumbled to her knees. He bent over her like a cloud, and his eyes glittered. He raised his mace to kill. But suddenly he too stumbled forward with a cry of bitter pain, and his stroke went wide, driving into the ground. Merry's sword has stabbed him from behind, shearing through the black mantle and passing up beneath the hauberk and pierced the sinew behind his mighty knee. Cried Merry. Then, tottering, struggling up, with her last strength, she drove her sword between crown and mantle, and the great shoulders bowed before her. The sword broke, sparkling into many shards. The crown rolled away with a clang. Éowyn fell forward upon her fallen foe, but lo! The mantle and hauberk were empty. Shapeless they lay now on the ground, torn and tumbled. And a cry went up into the shuddering air, and faded to a shrill wailing, passing with the wind. A voice bodiless and thin that died, and was swallowed up, and was never heard again in that age of this world. And there stood Meriadoc the Hobbit in the midst of the slain, blinking like an owl in the daylight, for tears blinded him, and through a mist he looked on Éowyn's fair head, as she lay and did not move. And he looked on the face of the king, fallen in the midst of his glory. For Snowmane in his agony had rolled away from him again, yet he was the bane of his master. Then Merry stooped and lifted his hand to kiss it, and lo! Théoden opened his eyes, and they were clear, and he spoke in a quiet voice, though laboured. "Farewell, Master Horridler," he said. "My body is broken, and I go to my fathers. And even in their mighty company I shall not now be ashamed. I felled the black serpent, the grim morn, and the glad day, and the golden sunset." Merry could not speak, but wept anew. "Forgive me, Lord," he said at last, "if I broke your command, and then have done no more in your service than to weep at our parting." The old king smiled. "Grieve not. It is forgiven. Great heart will not be denied. Live now in blessedness, and when you sit in peace with your pipe, think of me. For never now shall I sit with you in Meduseld as I promised, or listen to your Herblore. He closed his eyes, and Merry bowed beside him. Presently he spoke again. Where is Eomer? For my eyes darken, and I would see him ere I go. He must be king after me, and I would send word to Eowyn. She would not have me. She would not have me leave her. And now I shall not see her again, dearer than daughter.
Lord,
began Merry brokenly.
she is...
But at that moment there was a great clamour, and all about them horns and trumpets were blowing. Merry looked around. He had forgotten the war, and all the world beside, and many hours it seemed since the king rode to his fall, though in truth it was only a little while. But now he saw that they were in danger of being caught in the very midst of the great battle that would soon be joined. New forces of the enemy were hastening up the road from the river, and from under the walls came the legions of Morgul, and from the southward fields came footmen of Harad with horsemen before them, and behind them rose the huge backs of the Mumakil with war towers upon them. But northwards the white crest of Eomer led the great front of the Rohirrim, which he had again gathered and marshalled. And out of the city came all the strength of men that was in it, and the silver swan of Dolanroth was born in the van, driving the enemy from the gate. For a moment the thought flitted through Merry's mind.
Where's Gandalf? Is he not here? Could he not have seen the king in Eowyn?
But thereupon Eomer rode up in haste, and with him came the knights of the household that still lived, and had now mastered their horses. They looked in wonder at the carcass of the fell beast that lay there, and their steeds would not go near. But Eomer leapt from the saddle, and grief and dismay fell upon him as he came to the king's side and stood there in silence. Then one of the knights took the king's banner from the hand of Guthlaf, the banner-bearer who lay dead, and he lifted it up. Slowly Théoden opened his eyes. Seeing the banner, he made a sign that it should be given to Eomer.
Hail, King of the Mark,
he said.
Ride now to victory. Bid Eowyn farewell.
And so he died, and knew not that Eowyn lay near him. And those who stood by wept, crying,
Théoden King!
But Eomer said to them,
Mourn not overmuch. Might has fallen. Meet was his ending. When his mound is raised, women then shall weep. War now calls us.
Yet he himself wept as he spoke.
Let the knights remain here,
He said,
and bear his body in honor from the field, lest the battle ride over it. Yea, and all these other from the king's men that lie here.
and he looked at the slain, recalling their names. Then, suddenly he beheld his sister Eowyn as she lay, and he knew her. He stood a moment as a man who is pierced in the midst of a cry by an arrow through the heart, and then his face went deathly white, and a cold fury rose in him, so that all speech failed him for a while. A fey mood took him.
Eowyn!
He cried at last,
Eowyn! How came you here? What madness or devilry is this? Death, 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 take us all!
Then, without tasking counsel or waiting for the approach of the men of the city, he spurred headlong back to the front of the great host, and blew a horn, and cried aloud for the onset. Over the field rang his clear voice calling,
Ride! Ride! Ride to ruin! And the world's ended!
and with that the host began to move, but the Rohirrim sang no more. Death! They cried with one voice, loud and terrible, and gathering speed like a great tide, their battle swept about their fallen king, and passed, roaring away southwards. And yet still Meriadoc the Hobbit stood there blinking, through his tears, and no one spoke to him. Indeed, none seemed to heed him. He brushed away the tears, and stooped to pick up the green shield that Eowyn had given him, and he slung it at his back. Then he looked for his sword that he had let fall, for even as he struck his blow his arm was numbed, and now he could only use his left hand, and behold there lay his weapon, but the blade was smoking like a dry branch that has been thrust in a fire. And as he watched it, it writhed and withered and was consumed. So passed the sword of the Barrow Downs, work of Westernesse, but glad would he have been to know its fate who wrought it slowly long ago in the North Kingdom when the Dunedain was still young. And chief among their foes was the dread realm of Angmar and its sorcerer king. No other blade, not though mightier hands had wielded it, would have dealt that foe a wound so bitter, cleaving the undead flesh, breaking the spell that knit his unseen sinews to his will. Men now raised the king, and laying cloaks upon the spear truncheons, they made shift to bear him away towards the city. And others lifted Eowyn gently up and bore her after him. But the men of the king's household they could not yet bring from the field, for 7 of the king's knights had fallen there, and Eowyn their chief was among them. So they laid them apart from their foes and the fell beast that set spears about them. And afterwards, when all was over, men returned and made a fire there, and burned the carcass of the beast. But for Snowmane they dug a grave, and set up a stone upon which it was carved the tongues of Gondor in the mark. Faithful servant, yet master's bane. Lightfoot's foe, swift Snowmane. Green and long grew the grass on Snowmane's howe, but ever black and bare was the ground where the beast was burned. Now slowly and sadly Merry walked beside the bearers, and he gave no more heed to the battle. He was weary and full of pain, and his limbs trembled as with a chill. Great rain came out of the sea, and it seemed that all things wept for Théoden and Eowyn, quenching the fires in the city with grey tears. It was through a mist that presently he saw the van of the men of Gondor approaching. Imrahil, prince of Dol Amroth, rode up and drew rein before them. He cried.
Théoden king,
They answered.
he is dead, but Eomer king now rides in the battle. He with the white crest in the wind.
Then the prince went from his horse and knelt by the bier in honour of the king and his great onset. And he wept, and rising he looked then on to Eowyn and was amazed.
Surely here is a woman.
He said.
Have even the women of the Rohirrim come to war in our need? Nay, one only.
They answered.
Lady Eowyn is she, sister of Eomer, and we knew naught of her riding until this hour, and greatly we rue it.
Then the prince, seeing her beauty, though her face was pale and cold, touched her hand as he bent to look more closely on her.
Men of Rohan, he cried, are there no leeches among you? She is hurt to the death, maybe, but I deem that she yet lives.
And he held the bright burnished embrace that was upon his arm before her cold tips, and behold, a little mist was laid on it hardly to be seen.
Haste is now needed,
he said, and he sent one riding back swiftly to the city to bring aid. But he, bowing low to the fallen, bade them farewell, and mounting rode away into the battle. And now the fighting waxed furious on the fields of the Pelennor, and the din of arms rose upon high, with the crying of men and the neighing of horses. Horns were blown and trumpets were braying, and the Mumakil were bellowing as they were goaded to war. Under the south walls of the city, the footmen of Gondor now drove against the legions of Morgul that were still gathered there in strength. But the horsemen rode eastward to the succour of Eomer. Hurin, the tall warden of the Keys, and the lord of Losanach, and Hirluin of the Green Hills, and Prince Imrahil the Fair with his knights all about him. Not too soon came their aid to the Rohirrim, for fortune had turned against Eomer, and his fury had betrayed him. The great wrath of his onset had utterly overthrown the front of his enemies, and great wedges of his riders had passed clear through the ranks of the Southrons, discomfiting their horsemen and riding their footmen to ruin. But wherever the Mumakil came, there the horses would not go, but blenched and swerved away, and the great monsters were on foot and stood like towers of defence. And the Haradrim rallied about them, and the Rohirrim at their onset were thrice outnumbered by the Haradrim alone. Soon their case became worse, for new strength came now streaming to the field out of Osgiliath. They had been mustered for the sack of the city and the rape of Gondor, waiting on the call of their captain. He now was destroyed, but Gothmog, the lieutenant of Morgul, had flung them into the fray. Easterlings with axes, and Variags of Khand, Southrons in scarlet, and out of far Harad, black men like half-trolls with white eyes and red tongues. Some now hastened up behind the Rohirrim. Others held westward to hold off the forces of Gondor and prevent their joining with Rohan. It was even as the day thus began to turn against Gondor and their hope wavered that a new cry went up in the city. It being then mid-morning, and a great wind blowing, and the rain flying north, and the sun shining. In that clear air, watchmen on the walls saw afar a new sight of fear, and their last hope left them. For Anduin, from the bend at the Harlond, so flowed that from the city men could look down on it lengthwise for some leagues, and the far-sighted could see any ships that approached. And looking thither they cried in dismay, for black against the glittering stream they beheld a fleet borne up on the wind. Dromons and ships of great draught, with many oars, and with black sails bellying in the breeze.
The Corsairs of Umbar!
Men shouted.
The Corsairs of Umbar! Look! The Corsairs of Umbar are coming! Somil Falas has taken Eldirthir, and Lebanon is gone! The Corsairs...
And some without order, for none could he found to command them in their city, ran to the bells and tolled the alarms. And some blew the trumpets sounding the retreat.
Back to the walls!
They cried,
Back to the walls! Come back to the city before all are overwhelmed!
but the wind that sped the ships blew all their clamour away. The Rohirrim indeed had no need of news or alarm. All too well they could see for themselves the black sails, for Eomer was now